Okay. I'm just going to quickly introduce our panelists. I'm Mitu Gulati. I teach at Duke. I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll go quickly because while we gave the first session a lot of time to set the stage, the sessions from now on are going to be rather quick. And so for my panelists who have all promised to not take more than their 5 to 7 minutes so that we have at least some discussion. So just basically the setup, while we didn't really have a theme for each of these panels, we kind of did. And the we kind of did for this one has to do with the fact that we have some incredibly interesting people from the organizational side. And so I'll introduce the people we have, and they will bring a radically different perspective to this problem, in particular, radically different from the one that we have been talking about, where we're talking about how would courts deal with it? How would Title VII deal with it? Well, that's not the only place that these problems are dealt with. Largely, most of the action takes place on the workplace floor. And if you ever go to an Academy of Management meetings or you go to a labor economics conference, they don't talk about Title VII. They don't talk about how the law operates or where should we draw the line. They talk about how could organizations work within these pressures, and what are organizations going to do in order to interpret the law? And so this panel is really about talking about those different perspectives. So the first person who's going to talk is Tristin Green. Tristin is a law professor at Seton Hall, but she's on in this session because she's done absolutely wonderful work on workplace culture, some of the best work out there, I think. Then we have Ashleigh Rosette, who is across the way at Fuqua, who does work on organizational behavior. So actually talking about the real evidence out there on the costs of performing your identity. I read Ashleigh's paper, and I still have that $47 million number, is that right, on the cost of straightening one's hair. It's not trivial at all, just in dollar terms. Then Paul Ades from Harrah. It's just so exciting that we have Paul here. We have promised not to beat up on Paul.
You outed me.
But you know, one of the things that I did when Devin and I were thinking about this problem along with Gauri, and Gauri talked about already how she went to Harrah's, is that I went to Las Vegas, and my dean is gone, right, because I actually submitted a receipt for this. I went to Las Vegas, and I went from casino to casino and talked to personnel directors and asked them why they had these kinds of ridiculous restrictions. And it was just so interesting because most of them talk about what it is like to manage a firm in Las Vegas. And they talk about the kinds of people who come to Las Vegas and want to work, and how it's really important, say, for the tennis instructors to have drug tests, how it's really important for the blackjack dealers to have other kinds of sorting mechanisms to make sure they won't run away with the money. And that they never talked about the need to degrade or the need to exercise power. But I would always ask, well, you know, if it is just about sorting and disciplining your workers, why discipline the women more? And, you know, so, but it is interesting that none of them talk in those terms. And finally, Laura Morgan Roberts and Darryl Roberts, my very, very dear friends who, Laura's work, her dissertation work, is in some ways what introduced Devin and me to this topic. It so spoke to us. But they combine, Laura teaches at Harvard Business School and Darryl studies religion in the doctoral program in Emory. They combine those two different perspectives to talk really about how it is that we can expect organizations to redefine what they're doing and whether we can really expect it, given that cultural profiling, a cool concept that they introduce, can really be expected to be removed. So that said, we'll go in the order that we have and then have questions. questions. Tristin.
Okay, remember that introduction, because I'm actually going to sidestep for a minute here. I understand why I'm on the panel, to talk about organizational choices and structural influences, but I'm actually working on another project in this area, and I can't resist the opportunity to get your feedback on it. So I will keep it to just a couple of minutes, and hopefully it'll tie in with what we're talking about here on the panel as well. I should start, I want to highlight the difference between the identity performance demands in cases like Price Waterhouse and Jesperson, and the identity performance demands in cases like, say, Rogers. We might think of this difference in terms of the discomfort that the employer is trying to ease, and we've talked a little bit about customer preference. In the Price Waterhouse and Jesperson type cases, I think arguably those involve discomfort with challenges to stereotypes or challenges to group-based norms. Women do and should wear makeup, men do not and should not wear makeup. Rogers and what I would call the assimilation demand cases, on the other hand, arguably involve what we might call discomfort with difference. It's the difference that's making people uncomfortable, whether customers or coworkers and employers, and here's the employer started trying to ease that discomfort. That's where we get the homogeneity incentive that Devin and Mitu have talked a bit about in their work. I think the distinction between these two types of cases may matter for a number of reasons, but I just want to touch on one of those reasons here today. As I see it, decisions about whether to regulate employer demands in the latter cases, in the assimilation demand cases, necessarily are complicated by the contact hypothesis in a way that those former demands are not. And this paper that I'm working on is tentatively titled Workplace Assimilation Demands and Social Equality. And what I'm trying to do in the paper, first off, is to reframe the workplace assimilation demand debate a bit, to expressly include the end goal of social equality. As I see it, the current debate about workplace assimilation demands tends to frame it in terms of individual interests. On the one side sits the employer's interest in trying to ease this discomfort, and on the other side sits the employee's interest in being saved the identity costs, the time costs, the material economic costs associated with demands to adhere to a white male norm. My point here is that beyond redress of the harms to a single individual, anti-discrimination law has a broader goal, and that is social equality, and that employment discrimination law, more specifically, aims to achieve that goal both by increasing material equality, that is, greater success in jobs, and also by breaking down negative stereotypes and reducing prejudice. And this is where the contact hypothesis comes in. Work is one of the few places, as we all know, where members of different social groups actually interact on a daily basis in our society. And the contact hypothesis, social science research on the contact hypothesis, suggests that this interpersonal contact, provided that certain conditions are met, can serve to ease intergroup hostility and break down negative stereotypes. But the debate concerning workplace assimilation demands has really tended to miss the goal of social equality altogether, and even where it's brought it in, it has failed to ask or consider whether workplace assimilation demands are likely to further or to hinder prejudice reduction through intergroup contact. You can see this in the judicial treatment of the cases, whether we're talking about Price Waterhouse Jesperson type cases or the assimilation demand cases, and you can also see it in the scholarship. Because even those scholars who emphasize identity tend to emphasize it in terms of identity, the cost to an individual, and framing it in terms of an autonomy interest frequently. And we saw that with the last panel as well. And they've done this to the exclusion of any broader societal effect. In fact, in reading Barbara Flagg's critique of Richard Ford, I thought an incredibly interesting critique, but I think he actually does us a service in his book when he pushes us to bring in broader societal goals into the analysis. He says, he's making two arguments there, but regardless of how you come down on the particulars of his arguments, I think he's right that at least we have to be thinking about both the individual plaintiffs and about the broader goals of social equality. But even absent from his broader discussion is the effect of workplace assimilation demands on prejudice. And if I'm right that one way in which anti-discrimination law furthers social equality is by reducing prejudice through intergroup contact, then we have to ask whether prohibiting assimilation demands in the workplace is likely to further or hinder that goal. This is largely an empirical inquiry, and as far as I know, there's no research directly on this point, but there is a large body of research on the contact hypothesis from which I think we might draw in thinking about workplace assimilation demands and prejudice reduction. So what does the research say? Well, actually, when I set out on this project originally, from just touching upon the research on a number of occasions, I expected it to be more of a cautionary tale. That is, I expected it to raise the tension between individual plaintiff interests on one side and broader social equality benefits on the other, because I knew that the more we personalize our interaction, the more likely we are to cross barriers. And I then thought, well, that might mean then that the more likely we are to reduce prejudice. In fact, the social science research, as I see it, seems to have moved away from this pure decategorization or recategorization approach in which we would try to eclipse or eliminate our subgroup categories, and instead have moved toward a more multiculturalist approach. There seem to be several reasons for this movement. One is the difficulty of generalizing benefits beyond the individual, both in terms of attitudes and in terms of stereotypes. And the other is potential for generating hostility from attempts to eliminate subgroup categories. Here, drawing largely on social identity theory, the research shows that when members of subgroups feel their group distinctiveness being threatened, they exhibit greater degrees of bias and hostility than if their distinctiveness is preserved. Okay, so what can we take from the debate? Well, that's what I'm hoping you can help me think about. So far, I think what it does is it suggests that we're wrong to assume that even aside from these individual harms to material wealth or identity, that workplace demands, assimilation demands are unproblematic or even beneficial to the group. And I think it complicates Ford's analysis of the effect of regulating workplace assimilation demands on the group and on the end goal of social equality. And relatedly, and this touches upon our earlier conversation today, it suggests that freedom in these relational behaviors, what we wear, what stories we tell, the jokes we laugh at, the people we have lunch with, it's important not just as a matter of individual autonomy, because it helps us define ourselves, but also as a matter of social equality, because this same relational behavior can signal membership in a subgroup which might have effects for reducing prejudice and attaining greater social equality. So there's my diversion. I hope I tied it in a bit. If you don't want to talk about it in this panel, and I understand why you might not.
No, great.
I hope we can at least talk about it at some point. I just couldn't resist the opportunity given the type of people who are in the room and the information I might get from having put it out on the table. So
this
there
is
it
much
It
actually
quick.
very connected to the research that Ashleigh and Laura
Great.
actually are very familiar with. Paul, do you want to?
Yes, thank you for having me and for giving Harrah the opportunity to speak here, and I'm particularly happy to be here. I went to Bolt Hall and was asked to join the law review, and when I did, I had the idea that I could be a professor, and the professors who graded my exams felt otherwise. So I'm particularly pleased to be here and listen to all of you and learn from all of you. I want to take a minute to talk about the context and the business climate at the time the personal best policy was implemented. Because when I travel, the first thing I hear, I'm from Las Vegas and I work there, is the sex, what happens here stays here advertising campaign. And people have that in mind, or perhaps have that in mind when they read the Jesperson decision. Harrah's was facing a very different business climate in the year 1999 and 2000. Its competitors, they had two sets of competitors. One was a group with casinos with exploding volcanoes and celebrity chef restaurants and star entertainers, and we had to compete against them, and we didn't, for the most part, have any of that. The second group was Native American casinos, which were springing up everywhere, and they have the same slot machines and table games as we do, and often were more convenient to get to than our Harrah's properties. So that was the business climate. It was a challenging business climate that Harrah's was facing. And it had to distinguish itself somehow, and it chose to distinguish itself through customer service and the quality of its customer service. In every customer survey it did, and it found that people were going there not just to be served a drink or not just to put a coin in a machine, but to get away, to have an escape, to have a night out. It was a form of entertainment. And we learned that customers overwhelmingly thought that part of good customer service was being served by someone who was well-groomed. And incorrectly or not, the overwhelming majority of those customers thought that well-groomed meant to have the attributes that appeared in our personal best policy. So that was the business climate, and we can debate on whether Harrah's did it well or did it very poorly, but that was the business climate it was facing, and that was the motivation. It had nothing to do with sex or sexing up female bartenders. If you go on the website and you see the uniform, male and female bartenders had long sleeve white shirts, bow ties, long pants, black shoes. It would have been very easy, as many of our competitors do in Las Vegas, to sex up the uniform and make this about sex, but they didn't. They were trying to make it about making it part of the Harrah's brand of service and to, at the same time, create an atmosphere that we learned our customers were looking for. As far as there were earlier comments about expressing identity and preserving identity at work, there are a lot of values that everyone agrees with or everyone feels strongly about. But when someone comes to work, it's not only identity that has to be suppressed, whether you're going to a law firm and dressing in a way you don't want to dress or at Harrah's. There are all sorts of other rights that everyone supports, but are restricted at work. My desk, I believe in no searches without probable cause. My desk can be searched. My belongings can be searched by my employer. Your rights that are, when the government tries to impinge on them, are called Fourth Amendment rights, are restricted at work. First Amendment rights are restricted at work. Freedom of religion is restricted at work. An employee cannot go and sermonize to other employees repeatedly in a manner that creates a harassing environment. So it is not just identity, but there are other values or behaviors that are common and that are people wish to express, but they're not permitted to express at work. As far as customer preference, we're in the business of having our customers come and have a good time and make money, so that we can make money and so that everyone can be successful, and that creates job security for employees as well, because there are less successful companies in casinos that have closed and haven't had the success that Harrah's has had. Customer service, I don't think is a boogeyman or a terrible word. I think the issue is or customer preference, I'm sorry. There's some customer preference that's clearly unacceptable, and we see it from time to time. We occasionally will get a customer who says, I do not want a dealer who is African American. I want an Asian dealer. We say absolutely not, and if the customer asks again, he's shown the door. Some customer preference is absolutely unacceptable. Other customer preference, I believe, is acceptable, and businesses have to be concerned about. The Whole Foods example is a good one. I didn't hear anyone in the room object to the idea of forbidding an employee at a natural food store from wearing leather or a T-shirt with a steak on it or fur, because it would offend customers. So I realize the group may have issues with what Harrah's believes its customers want, but that's what Harrah's was seeking to do, and it sought to do it in a manner that placed equal burdens on men and women, and we can debate whether it succeeded in doing that, but that's what it sought to do. And it sought to do through a policy that was objective as possible. I know it when I see it doesn't work with appearance standards in HR departments. We were trying to take away the subjectivity so that supervisors couldn't decide based on their own preferences who was dressed okay and who wasn't. So that was the background for the policy. A lot of that wasn't captured in the Jesperson decision. The last thing I wanted to say that also wasn't, that Judge Kaczynski, I think, got incorrect, is at the end he implored us to hire Ms. Jesperson back. We made an offer, an unconditional offer of reinstatement to her in February 2001, just a few months after she was terminated, and she turned that down. And it was an unconditional offer. She could come back to work with no makeup and pursue her lawsuit for damages and injunctive relief. So I just, that wasn't in the decision. I wanted that to be clear.
Thank you. Laura and Darryl.
Okay. Thank you very much for having us on the panel. I'm going to share just a couple of remarks that we prepared. Basically, we're not focusing as much on the case law. Instead, we're trying to deconstruct two things. The first thing that we would like to deconstruct is an understanding of why these types of rules are created and enforced. We acknowledge that in many ways, these types of grooming codes and appearance codes are very much about branding and are about customer preferences and a desire to create cohesion within an organization. But we also want to dig beneath those assumptions and talk a little bit about the social meaning that underlies the codes that are created. The second thing that we'd like to do is to deconstruct and perhaps problematize a little bit. Why are we uncomfortable with the imposition of certain codes and standards? And that was one of the questions that Dean Bartlett opened us with this morning. So our attempt to talk about why these rules are enforced, moving beyond the notion of cultural preferences, is to really start to talk about the culture of the organization itself, and to suggest that organizations are active agents in preserving values, cohesion, and also cultural hegemony within the organization through formal practices and informal assessments of individuals' ability to fit within the organization and the extent to which individuals might deviate from certain norms, practices, and behaviors within the organization. Now, Ashleigh and I, and Tracy, who's also here, Ashleigh's co-author, we teach organizational behavior, and we all of the time talk about, organizational behavior 101. You have to create a culture in the organization around which employees can cohere. It is appropriate, it is functional, it is valuable for organizations to have a set of core principles and values so that the inner workings of the organization can protect productivity as well as the quality of the work experience for all of the individuals within that particular context. So this is before we even move to the utility and the market-based perspective on culture, just the notion that culture is a good thing. The deconstruction of culture that Darryl and I started to implore is the notion that the dominant culture within organizations, the source of these values and beliefs, is often based upon those who have been in the position of power to create the culture, historically and currently. So that when we make decisions about what is appropriate, what is noble, what is professional, those assumptions are conflated with the power structure that already exists in organizations, such that white, male, Protestant, heterosexual, elite values and principles become privileged in that particular context. So then when you start to think about the culture that's created within the organization around which people are being assessed in terms of whether or not they fit or deviate in this culture, we think, and we use the term cultural profiling to talk about this subtle, ongoing practice of constant scrutiny. I'll give you some examples of cultural profiling. So a lunchtime conversation. We have a gubernatorial election coming up in Massachusetts. Lots of us have elections coming up. So you're having a conversation about an election, and coworkers might jokingly tell someone, "I cannot believe you're going to vote for that guy. You must be the only Democrat in the office." Another example, a secretary is admonished by her boss for playing rhythm and blues music on the radio, is told that the music itself is unprofessional and that it's also too loud. A woman of color receives a word of advice that her colleagues on her consulting team might be a little bit more comfortable with her if she would just smile a little more. And a professional of color is advised that he might want to soften his handshake and to lower the tone of his voice just a tad so that people would be even more comfortable. Or, one fun example, and these are all real examples, by the way. A fun example, an African-American man, high status in an elite organization, is often greeted when he's coming down the hall by his colleagues with the phrase, "Oh, here comes trouble." Now, these are all sort of seemingly neutral interactions in which individuals are being told the extent to which they fit or don't fit. So when we start to talk about cultural profiling, implicit in our discussion of cultural profiling is the notion that it's more than skin deep. So we appreciate the value of this conversation around appearance and makeup and dress codes and grooming. We think it's incredibly important. We greatly appreciate what Ashleigh and Tracy are going to share about hair and the cost of having to manage on that level. We're also talking about identity, performance, and cultural profiling as a mechanism that constrains people's choices about how they enact their identities more broadly. And that the discrimination that many individuals at more senior levels of organizations face today is not as much around the appearance and grooming codes. Those are challenges that individuals who are in lower levels, we talked about in the first panel, have less power to be able to create the standards and codes are more challenged. But individuals who are in more senior levels, like many of us in the room today, more of the challenges that we face are around signaling on a deeper level the extent to which we fit within an organization, we conform to the values, or that we're more likely in some way to deviate in ways that the system considers threatening. Let me give you an example. This is Edward Jones, did a study of 200 black managers in 1986, and he says, most black managers feel that to satisfy the values and expectations of the white corporate hierarchy, they must run a gauntlet of contradictory pressures. Running the gauntlet means smarting from the pain of prejudice, even as white colleagues deny that your reality of race has any impact. It means maintaining excellent performance even while recognition is withheld. It means being smart but not too smart, being strong but not too strong, being confident but not egotistical to the point of alienation, being the butt of prejudice and not being unpleasant or abrasive, being intelligent and not arrogant, being honest but not paranoid, being confident yet modest. It means seeking the trust and respect of fellow blacks and acceptance by whites, speaking out on issues affecting blacks, but not being perceived as a self-appointed missionary or unifaceted manager who is expert only on black issues, and it goes on. So what we're talking about here is a notion that cultural profiling actually creates a culture of bias and discrimination where individuals not only have to experience a certain level of scrutiny around their behavior, but that the scrutiny that they experience and their pressure, increased pressure to demonstrate that they fit, actually interferes with their ability to contribute maximally to the organization. So then, are we asking too much when we're asking organizations to create a context where individuals can experience a sense of authenticity? On the surface, perhaps we are. One of the analyses, though, that we like to bring in is the notion of psychological contract, and I know that many of you lawyers in the room, which you know that I am not, Darryl actually is, have a problem with the language contract around the employment relationship and take that very seriously. We in OB use that very loosely and with a lot of confidence. But that in this particular day and age, individuals are not receiving the same things from organizations that they did 20 years ago. So when individuals were expected to conform in terms of their appearance, their values, and their attitudes, number one, the workplace was less diverse, and so the culture of the organization was already matched in many ways to the culture that the individuals brought in it. That's not the case now. But even more than that, in exchange for that conformity, individuals received a certain level of security and stability. That is not the employment characteristic of the employment relationship today. It's far more temporal, it's far more tentative. And so what individuals value in that relationship is the opportunity while they're there to be able to make a maximal contribution, to experience some sense of fulfillment, and to not have to compromise their sense of self deeply and fundamentally. So the last thing that we do in our piece then is to talk about not just the legal ramifications and the business ramifications, but also the ethical ramifications of cultural profiling and how those might interfere with creating a society in which equity and inclusion is actually promoted by the actions of organizations and corporations, which is very much in keeping with where Tristin started us.
Great. Ashleigh?
That's an excellent lead-in to our work. So what Darryl and Laura...
I should introduce Tracy.
Yeah, that's the one thing I was going to do as
Tracy,
well.
Ashleigh's co-author, who's
right
been
back
very
there.
kind to come and join us.
And so first, thank you so much for inviting us. We're really happy to be here to present this work. And it really presented us a forum to really kind of actually concretely put on paper some ideas that Tracy and I have talked about since our days as PhD students. But Laura and Darryl's work leads into our work because they're talking about the broad concept of cultural profiling. Tracy and I focus on a specific group and a specific type of profiling with regards to African American women and the hairstyles that they choose to wear in their work environments. And so a hairstyle is very simple, right? You choose whether you're going to cut it, whether you're going to wear it long. Are we going to dye it today? Are we going to wear, something, a headband or something of that nature for women? It's a very simple choice. But for African American women, it's not a choice at all. In fact, what Tracy and I argue is that it's more like a dilemma, meaning a choice between two equally unfavorable outcomes regarding that could potentially adversely affect the people who are making these choices. So the title that we've given our essay is the following: The Hair Dilemma. Conform to mainstream expectations or emphasize racial identity. Now, we acknowledge that not all African American women experience this dilemma, but many do. And we anchor the paper actually in an arena that I'm not that familiar with, and that is some of the legal cases, some of them that are current and some of them that are not so current. And there are several that we draw upon, but typically the cases went something like an African-American woman felt that she was discriminated against because she chose to wear cornrows, as Darryl was talking about earlier, or she chose to wear dreadlocks, or she chose some type of ornate way to communicate her identity with her hair. And we chose these cases as the basis, but I am not a legal scholar. So what we chose to do was to look at this from a social, psychological perspective and really talk about what is the essence of this dilemma. And we focus on three things in the paper. The unique aspect of grooming that is unique solely to African American women and the type of hair that they have, the external pressures that are placed upon African American women, as well as the competing psychological preferences, competing psychological processes that occur within the African American woman herself and her community pressures that are there as well. So one of the things that, Mitu, that number that stood out to him in terms of the cost that African American women engage in terms of presenting themselves favorably, and it is $47 million a year. Now, we talk about this unique aspect of it because for many people, it's just a matter of cutting their hair or dyeing their hair. But for African American women, it's extremely costly. And not only that, it's actually dangerous in terms of straightening your hair and putting chemicals in your hair. And people have the burns and they have skin diseases as a result of trying to conform to these mainstream expectations that people have of them. So it's this unique aspect of many of the context of African American hair that it's normally kinky and tightly woven, but the expectation is that it should be long and flowing and straight so that people around you tend to be more comfortable. So we focus in the paper on this unique aspect and introduce that concept. The second concept that we talk about are these external pressures that are put on African American women and where these pressures come from. So the first thing we talk about is that they want to preserve their professional image. So why would a hairstyle contradict with this idea of professional image? And we have to go back and consider that for African Americans in general and African American women specifically, that their work ethic is sometimes coupled with a negative stereotype. So there's a seminal study that goes all the way back to 1933 where Katz and Braley talk about the perceptions that people have of African Americans back in the 1930s, and it's lazy and unmotivated and not really wanting to work very hard. Well, those blatant ideas of prejudice that were accepted in the 30s and started to phase out in the 60s and the 70s and so on, today, you don't find that blatant aspect of prejudice that's there towards African Americans or African American women in a public forum, I should say. But what you do find is what's left over, and that is the subtle prejudices that still have those underlying negative aspects attached to it. So when we say that they want to preserve their professional image, they don't want to do anything that causes an emphasis of that identity that may then cause those subtle negative stereotypes to come in and to persist and to affect their work negatively, so they'd be evaluated negatively. An additional external preference is that they want to avoid negative career consequences. So what we study about in organizational behavior is that, some of you guys may know the popular study, and that is that, Greg and Emily are more likely to be hired than are Lakeisha and Jamal, right? And it's simply the names that are latent with these negative stereotypes. So by emphasizing their racial identity, there are external pressures because they don't want their trajectory in their careers to be affected. And the third external pressure is that they want to fit in with their colleagues. We all know that people tend to gravitate to other people who look like them, who they are comfortable with, who they are similar to. And so in this regard, to have an African American woman come in with dreadlocks or with cornrows, it somewhat alienates that person because people want to be around people who are like them. And so therefore, when you're not like them, then it again may have some adverse effects on the African American woman who chooses to emphasize her racial identity in this way. So these are the external pressures that we focus on in terms of these social psychological processes around this hair choice. In addition, there are internal processes that African American women are faced in terms of this dilemma. Back in the mid-60s, they coined this term called the self-hatred theory. This was Greer's and Cobb, and I think some of you may be familiar with this theory. And it was around the height of the Black Power movement, and the theory basically went something to the effect of Black women who choose to straighten their hair are basically saying that I am devaluing my Black identity because I value a different standard of beauty. So therefore, internally, I must have I'm devaluing myself. I hate to use the word hatred. I know that's the title of the theory, but that's kind of what was happening there with this whole title of self-hatred theory. So a Black woman has to choose in terms of whether she's going to, engage in this self-degradation, if you will, or whether she, again, is going to choose to conform to the mainstream. Now, some women would instead, who disagree with this idea of self-hatred theory, say it's just a presentation. It's just the way that I'm walking into the room. And so some have this idea that, you are conforming and it's a degradation to yourself. Others, however, say that, it's just the way that I am. But for many African American women, they choose not to conform and to actually accept the potential negative consequences because the price is simply too high. The tension, the internal conflict that it causes is simply too high. So all of this is to say that for African American women, a hair choice, a decision, it's not merely a choice, it's a decision that's laden with a dilemma that is laden with many negative consequences and outcomes that they must address. So I think I'm at my 7 minutes.
Great. So we have very little time for questions, but this was in part meant to set the stage for the next set of discussions, and Catherine will shoot me if I don't have us go on time. But we'll take a few questions. Brian?
Sure. I had an important question, I think, for the business panel. Set it up very simplistically. I think both sides of this issue, the progressive side and the libertarian conservative side, want to maximize liberty in one way. The progressive side wants liberty maximized such that the employee can perform his or her identity in the workplace. The conservative libertarian side wants the employer to have the flexibility to make rules about the workplace and for the employee to have the flexibility to go and make the choice to work here or work there, depending upon how that employee's preferences match the employer's preferences with regard to appearance. But the libertarian and conservative argument is dependent upon the free market solving these problems. And so I would like to ask the business panel here, why or why not do you think the free market can solve these problems and maximize liberty?
I think there's an assumption that, and I don't remember who mentioned this earlier, but I think that there is a false assumption, it may have been you, a false assumption about the notion of choice and how much of the market is really free in terms of how much agency individuals have, and that there is an overemphasis on the notion of agency with respect to employment choices and the ability for alternatives, particularly when we think about the fact that many of the organizations actually have the same fundamental standards and principles around appearance. So it's not like there's a myriad of choices and a myriad of organizations and all individuals have to do is find the perfect fit. There is a hegemony that society has fostered that says that across the board, dreadlocks are less professional, tattoos are less professional, and so it's a bit of an illusion to suppose that the individual can then just find the perfect employer if one place doesn't necessarily fit. But I do think that there's a challenge, a tension, and probably even a paradox at play that we have to deal with in terms of reconciling the interests of the corporation and the interests of the individual, and that's always been the fundamental challenge in the employment relationship.
Do you have a follow-up?
Oh, yeah, a quick follow-up question is there a way to solve the market failure then? Because I think that if we take a business approach to this and say, the market's not working properly, what can we do to incentivize the right behavior, our entire issue might be resolved. I mean, this tension between the two value systems. Do any of you have thoughts about that?
I'm not sure where you're going with that, in the sense that anti-discrimination law, as I understand it, has always been a market intervener to some extent, because the market doesn't take care of the problem. Like, this is an age-old debate, and I think there's a fairly good understanding that discrimination is sufficiently embedded in society, particularly in the workplace, that the market itself isn't going to solve the problem, right?
Well, I'm wondering if there are incentives. I mean, are we thinking about, a lot of us are thinking about this from the perspective of what can the law do to dictate behavior?
Yeah.
Are there ways that we can take creative approaches within the marketplace
Yeah.
to encourage people to make the right choices inherently? You know what I mean?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think as Ryan was identifying, there's this inherent tension between, on the one hand, we have to understand that corporations want to hire for fit, and that there's some benefit, even to the individuals in the workplace, for hiring for fit, that they have some similar starting point for coming together and working together and benefiting from working together. But then on the other hand, we have both identity problems and discrimination problems associated with what is typically imposed, which is the white male norm. And how do we go about regulating that culture fit without destroying the social relations benefits of that fit? And that in some of my earlier work, I've tried to think about other ways other than a legal rights approach, which says you have an independent right to be free from these identity demands, ways, and I think that's what you're getting at. Are there other ways in which we might try to encourage? I think the diversity movement is, to some extent, one way that has been caught up in the business world, and the people from business schools will know better than I, but my sense is that that's common now in the business context, is that valuing diversity. And I think that's a positive, but it also has to be tied to anti-discrimination norms.
Yeah, I think in the business world, that, I mean, I would agree that there is, this idea of valuing diversity, but I think that that isn't necessarily enough, to be honest. I think people oftentimes have the best of intentions to affect, the way in which the market is perceiving this, but there are simply too many biases that creep in and affect the decision-making process that prohibit it. So I think as an organizational behavioralist, I think that it requires genuine perspective taking, and not perspective taking in terms of just, oh, I understand, I see what's going on with you, but I mean true perspective taking. To kind of give you an example, I had a colleague who didn't understand exactly what I was talking about in my work regarding white privilege. And so I was trying to explain it to him, but he just wasn't getting it. So I took him to my church with me. It's a very large African-American church. I'd say roughly about 1,500 people who attend this church. And he was probably maybe one of two white people who were in the church. And he got it within the first 2 minutes of being there. So I think that saying I value diversity isn't necessarily enough to affect these market factors. There has to be explicit perspective taking that goes on, and I think that's kind of the what to is in terms of what you're asking about, or the how to, and how we enact that. I mean, that's a whole other can of worms.
And also, just to kind of extend on that point, I think one of the things that the diversity conversation added to the business world was that there's a sense that if we allow people from diverse backgrounds, that they will bring an added value to the workplace because of the skills and talents that they bring. But as others have kind of pointed out, legal scholars and people in organizational behavior have shown that there's often been a failure on employers' part to really utilize and tap into the diversity and the benefits of that diversity that is brought by opening up the marketplace to individuals. So I think one of the ways to begin to address this is to begin to see that there's something that the marketplace and corporations are truly missing out when they don't create the environment and the conditions in which people from various backgrounds and perspectives can truly flourish in the workplace. So that's more than, it means more than just hiring somebody who's a person of color, but it also means, looking at the policies themselves to see whether or not they reflect, whether they're inclusive, whether it also means changing your promotion standards. So, does the people in upper management reflect, the diversity within the larger society itself? Are you really tapping into the experiences and talents that people bring from diverse backgrounds, or we just have a traditional kind of old boys network? So I think one of the ways to begin to address this is to really help corporations and employers to begin to see that there is great value that is added to it, and so that the more they allow people to express that and to contribute, the more the corporation itself will benefit.
All right, I'm sure Ryan is raising his hand to tell me to get on with it and stop the panel.
I have one more question that was raised by this panel that I'm not sure that will be addressed later, so I just want to ask it now. It's very basic. What makes appearance different than some of the other rights that Mr. Ades brought up, such as Fourth Amendment and First Amendment rights that you don't necessarily bring to the workplace in their entirety?
Okay, and you're going to let us address that in the remainder of the day, because otherwise Catherine will shoot me, because we have to go right to the next panel, or there won't be enough time for lunch and things like that. So, but we're going to keep this going.
Thank you.
Thank you.